Eliza Moore left the courthouse around 6 p.m., her mind still reeling from a long and stressful day. The soft hum of her car's engine was the only sound as she glided along the dimly lit streets toward home. The pale glow of streetlights cast a hazy, almost dreamlike atmosphere over the road, as though reflecting the fog of exhaustion clouding her thoughts. She turned on the radio, letting smooth jazz filter through the quiet, hoping to find some relief in the gentle melodies. Eliza's commute was usually uneventful, but today the traffic was unusually dense. Cars crawled along, their red brake lights glowing in a seemingly endless line ahead of her. Despite the slow pace, she felt no rush. Her only desire was to get home, sink into her favorite armchair, and let the day melt away. But just as the tension began to ease, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror, and the blare of a police siren broke the peaceful silence. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She checked her speed. She hadn't been driving too fast. Confused but composed, she slowly pulled over to the side of the road. Two police officers emerged from their car, one tall and muscular, the other younger, with an air of arrogance. Eliza rolled down her window and greeted them with a polite but calm smile. The taller officer, whose name tag read Harris, approached Eliza's window first, his cold eyes assessing her silently before speaking. "Ma'am, do you know why we stopped you?" he asked, his voice steady, but with an edge of authority that made Eliza feel uneasy. Behind him, the younger officer, O'Connor, stood with his arms crossed, a sneer playing on his lips, his eyes filled with an almost mocking arrogance. Eliza glanced between the two men, keeping her composure. "No, officer. I don't believe I was breaking any laws," she replied, her voice calm but firm. As a judge, she had learned the importance of remaining composed in all situations, but something about this encounter felt different. There was an underlying tension in the air that made her uncomfortable. O'Connor stepped closer, leaning slightly toward her window, his expression darkening. "You think you're above the law, don't you?" he spat, his tone laced with contempt. "You passed another car illegally back there, but I guess you think you can get away with it." The accusation hit Eliza like a slap, not because it was true, but because of the way it was delivered. She knew she hadn't passed any cars illegally. This was something else, something more than just a traffic stop. The condescension in O'Connor's voice wasn't just about a supposed violation. It was personal, aimed at her in a way that cut deeper than a simple traffic infraction. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way. Eliza had spent her entire life navigating a world where people like her, black, ambitious, successful, were seen as outsiders, or worse, as threats. The look in O'Connor's eyes wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same look she had seen many times before, the same kind of disdain masked as authority. But Eliza wasn't someone to be easily intimidated. She straightened in her seat, meeting O'Connor's gaze directly. "I didn't pass anyone illegally, officer. If there's a misunderstanding, we can handle this respectfully," she said, her voice measured and controlled. O'Connor's sneer deepened, and he leaned even closer, his face mere inches from hers. "Respectfully," he echoed mockingly. "You think you're entitled to respect? Huh? Who do you think you are?" Eliza's patience thinned, but she kept her calm. She knew better than to escalate the situation. "I'm not asking for anything special, officer. I'm simply requesting that we resolve this the right way." But O'Connor wasn't interested in resolving anything. His sneer curled into a smile, cold and condescending. "Sign the ticket, or things are going to get worse for you," he threatened. Before Eliza could respond, Harris, who had been silent until now, took a step forward. His presence loomed over the car, and his voice, though quieter, was no less threatening. "You're not getting away with anything just because you think you're someone special. We can take this to the station if you want." The implication was clear. Eliza could feel the injustice rising like bile in her throat. These men weren't interested in upholding the law. They were testing her, trying to exert their power in a way that had nothing to do with right or wrong. But she wasn't going to let them. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she looked between the two officers. "I won't sign anything. If you feel the need to take me to the station, then I'll be ready to defend myself in court." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the officers hesitated. O'Connor's eyes flickered with anger, but there was also something else: uncertainty. Eliza could see it, even if he was trying to hide it behind his aggression. Harris looked at his partner, their silent exchange filled with tension. "You think you have the right to refuse us?" O'Connor snapped, stepping even closer, his voice rising. "Who do you think you are?" Eliza didn't flinch. "I know my rights," she replied evenly. "And I know when I'm being wrongfully treated." The two officers stood there for a moment, their dominance challenged by her calm refusal to back down. Eliza knew they hadn't expected this. They had expected submission, fear. But she had spent years fighting for what was right, and she wasn't about to let them intimidate her now. O'Connor was the first to break. He pulled back, seething, clearly frustrated that Eliza hadn't crumbled. Harris glanced at him, his brow furrowed, before he turned back to Eliza. "You'll regret this," Harris muttered, but the threat sounded hollow, like the words of someone who knew they had already lost the battle. They exchanged another glance, and without another word, Harris turned and walked back to the patrol car, O'Connor trailing behind him reluctantly. As they walked away, Eliza felt the adrenaline slowly drain from her body. She had stood her ground, but she knew this wasn't over. She watched as the officers conferred by their vehicle, their voices too low for her to hear. Her mind raced, contemplating the next move, knowing she couldn't let her guard down just yet. Eliza remained seated in her car, her heart still racing, but her resolve firm. She knew this wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. The two officers were no longer simply trying to enforce the law, they were trying to prove something. She had seen it in their eyes, the way O'Connor had leaned into her space with that sneer of superiority, the way Harris had tried to use his authority to make her feel small. It was a power play, plain and simple, and she refused to play along. Moments later, Harris returned to her window, his expression dark and his voice more forceful this time. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his words dripping with frustration. "We can settle this right here, or we can take you down to the station." Eliza didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady, meeting his eyes without a hint of fear. "If I've done something wrong, officer, I will face the consequences. But I won't sign anything until I know what I'm being accused of. I didn't break any laws." Harris leaned closer, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour against the cool evening air. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can outsmart us because you know the law. Let me tell you something, lady. We don't need to play by the rules when it comes to people like you." There it was, the thinly veiled threat, the unspoken implication that Eliza had sensed from the very beginning. She had heard it before, seen it in the eyes of others who had tried to belittle her because of her race, because she was a black woman who had dared to rise through the ranks and become a respected judge in the state of Georgia. But she wasn't going to back down. "I know my rights," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "And I know when I'm being harassed." Harris's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, O'Connor appeared at his side, his lips twisted into that familiar smirk. "You think you're going to win this, don't you?" he taunted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Let me guess, you think because you're some big shot, you can walk away from this?" Not this time. Eliza's patience was wearing thin, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to remain composed. Any sign of anger or fear would only fuel their need to dominate her. She had seen this kind of power struggle before, both in and out of the courtroom, and she knew that the only way to win was to stay in control of herself. "I don't expect to walk away from anything," she replied, her voice as calm as ever. "But I do expect to be treated fairly. If there's a legitimate charge against me, I will comply. But if you think you can intimidate me into signing something I don't believe in, you're mistaken." O'Connor laughed, a harsh sound that grated on Eliza's nerves. "You really think you have a choice?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're either going to sign this ticket, or we're taking you in. Your choice." For a moment, Eliza considered her options. She could sign the ticket and be done with this ordeal, but that would mean surrendering to their bullying tactics, admitting to something she hadn't done. Or she could stand her ground, knowing full well that the situation could escalate. She weighed the risks, her mind racing as the two officers loomed over her, waiting for her to break. Finally, Eliza made her decision. "I'm not signing anything," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving O'Connor's. If you feel the need to take me to the station, then do it. But I won't be coerced into admitting guilt where there is none." The air between them crackled with tension, and for a brief moment, neither officer moved. Then, without warning, O'Connor reached for the door handle, yanking the door open with a sharp tug. "Get out of the car," he ordered, his voice harsh and commanding. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, but she remained outwardly calm. She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of compliance. She knew the situation was dangerously close to spiraling out of control, and the last thing she wanted was for it to turn violent. Harris stepped forward, grabbing her by the arm with more force than necessary, pulling her toward the patrol car. "You want to play tough? Let's see how tough you are in a cell," he muttered under his breath, his grip tightening painfully around her arm. Eliza winced but didn't resist. She knew that any sign of struggle could be used against her later. She let them lead her to the back of the patrol car, where O'Connor opened the door with a smug grin. "Get in," he ordered, giving her a small shove toward the seat. Eliza climbed into the back of the car, her mind racing. She knew she hadn't broken any laws, and she knew that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple traffic stop. These officers were determined to make her feel powerless, but she wasn't about to let them win. As the door slammed shut behind her, she took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. If they wanted to take this to the next level, so would she. She quickly dialed the number of Sheriff James Porter, a longtime friend and colleague who she knew would handle the situation fairly. "James, it's Eliza," she said when he picked up. "I've been pulled over by 2 officers, and they're threatening to take me to the station for refusing to sign a ticket I didn't deserve. Can you meet me here?" Porter's response was immediate. "I'll be right there," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Stay calm, Eliza. I'm on my way." Eliza hung up the phone and leaned back against the seat, her heart still pounding, but her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't alone in this fight, and she wasn't going to let them intimidate her into submission. She had faced bigger challenges than this before, and she would come out of this one stronger too. Minutes later, a second patrol car pulled up beside them, its red and blue lights flashing in the darkness. Sheriff James Porter stepped out, his face a mask of controlled anger as he approached the scene. Harris and O'Connor exchanged nervous glances, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Porter strode over to Eliza's car first, glancing at her through the window before turning his attention to the 2 officers. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with authority. Harris stammered, clearly caught off guard. She refused to sign a ticket for passing illegally," he said, his confidence visibly shaken. Porter's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" he said, his tone dangerous. "And did she actually commit any violation?" Harris hesitated, and in that moment, Porter knew the truth. He turned back to Eliza, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Eliza nodded. "I'm fine, James. Thank you for coming." Sheriff James Porter turned back to Harris and O'Connor, his eyes now full of barely concealed anger. "Let me make this clear," he said slowly, each word a warning. "This is Judge Eliza Moore. You just detained a sitting judge over a supposed violation you can't even confirm. Do you have any idea what you've done?" O'Connor's face paled visibly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Harris, on the other hand, tried to salvage the situation, his voice faltering as he spoke. She refused to sign the ticket, Sheriff. We were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Porter snapped, his voice rising. "Protocol is respecting the rights of citizens, especially when they haven't broken any laws. Did either of you even try to handle the situation properly, or were you just trying to throw your weight around?" Neither officer responded, their silence a clear admission of guilt. Porter sighed, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "Get her out of the car," he ordered, his voice sharp and final. Harris, now visibly shaken, quickly opened the door and motioned for Eliza to step out. She did so, her gaze steady as she walked toward Porter. Despite everything that had happened, she maintained her composure, a silent testament to the strength that had carried her through years of fighting for justice. "I apologize for the treatment you've received, Eliza," Porter said quietly, his anger now replaced with regret. "This never should have happened." Eliza nodded, appreciating his words, but the weight of the incident still hung heavily between them. "Thank you for coming, James," she replied, her voice calm, though the frustration and disappointment were clear beneath the surface. Porter turned back to Harris and O'Connor, his face stern. You both will report to my office first thing in the morning for an internal review. This behavior is unacceptable, and it won't go unpunished. The two officers nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact with both Eliza and the sheriff. Their earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by the grim realization of the consequences they would soon face. As the confrontation drew to a close, Porter gestured toward Eliza's car. Let me escort you home, Eliza. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone. Eliza hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. She was strong, but after the exhausting day she had already endured, the thought of someone ensuring her safe return home was a relief she couldn't deny. As they both got into their respective vehicles and drove off, Eliza's thoughts wandered. This encounter was yet another reminder of the battle she faced every day, not just in the courtroom, but in every corner of society. Even as a judge, even with the power she held, she wasn't immune to the prejudice and discrimination that still lingered beneath the surface of the world she lived in. The quiet hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of the road under her tires couldn't drown out the persistent question in her mind. How many more times would she have to prove herself? How many more battles like this would she have to fight just to be seen as equal? As Eliza pulled into her driveway, she parked the car and sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. The weight of the day, the confrontation with the officers, the injustice, it all settled heavily on her shoulders. She exhaled slowly, reminding herself that this battle was far from over. But even in the midst of her exhaustion, a quiet determination rose within her. She had faced situations like this before, and she would face them again. As long as there were systems that allowed discrimination and prejudice to persist, people like her would have to keep standing up, fighting for what was right. Stepping out of the car, Eliza looked up at the darkened sky, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol for so many others who faced the same struggles. And for them, for herself, she would continue to fight. Because in the end, it wasn't about one traffic stop or even one battle. It was about justice, equality, and ensuring that no one, no matter their background, had to face what she had endured. Eliza walked inside, ready for whatever came next.